And the sun's in my eyes, that's wonderful. Hello friends. Welcome to the floor. This is part 2 of my gift guide, in which I will be talking about books. I am sat on the floor next to the bookcase because I'm ill and I have so many projects on at the moment and work is work. So yeah, this is what you're getting, roll with it. I have 3 piles of books behind me which will cover 3 different possible gift categories, and then at the end I might go into some of the books that I don't have but really want for Christmas. So you can decide early on which bits of the video you want to hang around for or not. The first category we're going to go over is art and reference books. Then we're going to look at modern sewing and other crafts, and finally we're going to do the historical dressmaking books because, let's be honest, there's only so many historical dressmaking books and everyone basically talks about the same ones. So if you've never seen a historical book thing before, that's probably really useful to you. If you have, I'm not going to make you sit through it again. So at the top of the pile we have art books and reference books. I think this is the ideal gifting category. Art books are incredible to have around, I love looking at them, they give me so much inspiration, but they're not something that I usually buy for myself, and that is, after all, the ideal for a gift. It's something that you want but wouldn't get normally. Yes. So you have a bunch of different options when going for art books. You can pick an art book from a movie that they like. This is the book from Crimson Peak. Movie books don't tend to stay around for very long, so if it's a recent release, you can probably find something. If it's not, you might struggle or it might be expensive. If something's a little bit expensive and hard to justify spending on yourself, but is within your budget as a gift, that can be really great. I have a whole heap of anime and manga art books, mostly manga, are an amazing source of really unusual designs. Again, if you know that there's a series or artist that someone you like is really into, you can pretty much guarantee there will be a book for it, but it might be a little bit hard to find. And then there are art books by artists. So I've got 2 Dover publications here. One is Dulac and one is Arthur Rackham. Both of them did kind of fairy tale and children's books illustrations, and they're from Dover, who's a big publisher. But also you do get art books from independent artists. Here I've got one by Stephanie Puimin-Law and one by Julie Dillian. Both of these I had to get direct from the artist because they're a little bit more unusual and they have a limited print run and all this good stuff. And again, I use these all the time for inspiration. Then we are on to modern sewing. I don't get a lot of modern sewing books because in general I make it up as I go along. But one series that I love and really recommend are Gertie's books. If you have someone who is looking to get into vintage sewing in particular, in terms of wealth of information and diversity of stuff included in it, Gertie's new book for better sewing, and then I think there are 2 subsequent ones. One is for casual wear and one is for dresses. These are really good. They kind of assume you can sew in a straight line and roll from there, but that means that they go up to quite a high level and start you in on things like flat pattern drafting, making adjustments, fit issues, really couture seam finishes, all kinds of very high level stuff. I think these are a better jumping in point if someone has the absolute basics down than getting them a kind of beginner's learn to sew book. They also, the patterns come as actual paper patterns in the thing, instead of as a thing that you have to print out, which I really appreciate. The other modern sewing books that I think make great gifts are something like this. This one's called the Stylish Dress Book, but there's lots of other books from the same publisher. They are Japanese sewing books that have been translated into English. These are a little bit higher level in that they will give you quite minimal instructions and expect you to be able to figure out what they mean. Especially during lockdown, basically all I've wanted to wear is loosely fitted cotton sacks, and these books will provide you with that. If you know anyone who is looking to live their cottagecore aesthetic, this is the kind of place you want to look. Nice, modern, cottagey, minimalist, Japanese. Niceness. Then we are into other crafts. If you know someone is interested in getting into a new craft, a book on that craft is normally a really, really good idea. I'm not going to go too much into books on spinning and weaving and other kinds of crafts that I'm more established with, because those involve kind of extensive kit as well, which, yeah, I mean, if you're buying someone a spinning wheel for Christmas, then yeah, get them a book about having a spinning wheel. In terms of crafts that you can just pick up, this is a book that I love, The Modern Girl's Guide to Hat Making. It goes through from kind of things that you can just sew to stuff which involves actually using a hat block. I really like it because it covers all of the skill levels and doesn't initially require you to get any specialist materials. Haven't made many projects from this yet, but I've found the instructions really good for the ones that I have done. Card weaving is something that I keep meaning to pick up, and I actually got given this book and a set of tablet weaving cards, which was very much appreciated, and I will definitely do that at some point. Yes, this is a very small craft. It's something where you reasonably can give someone the gift of a book and a set of tablet weaving cards. And this book does take you from the absolute basics to something a little bit more complicated, like what's on the front. I'm sure there are other craft ideas you can think of that would do a similar thing. This is just one that I know I really enjoyed. Another thing that people often tell me they want to get into but don't know how to start is embroidery. I basically only do two kinds of embroidery. The first one of which is crewel, which is not typically for clothing, but it's never stopped me. And if you're wanting to get into crewel embroidery, the books I recommend are by this person called Hazel Blomkamp, unclear. But so there is Cruel Twists and Cruel Intentions. And yes, I was sold on the pun names. These cover the basic stitches and also some very modern twists on the original Jacobean stitches, and also take you through some projects. I think crewel embroidery is one of the better styles to pick up. You cover a lot of ground with not very much effort compared to doing, for example, satin stitch all over everything. And I think these books are really clear and really well laid out. And then the other style of embroidery that I've been starting to get into is stump work, and for that I have this book. This book is an absolute joy. It is very project focused, so it will show you how to do a whole bunch of different flowers. I do feel you can take the techniques that are in those different flowers and see how you could expand them out to do other things with them as well. And it is just a really lovely, well laid out book. I think you could absolutely give any of these as a gift. If you wanted to pad it out a bit more and get someone, you know, an embroidery hoop, some other materials to go with it, that would be great, but equally on their own they're still lovely. And now the bit that you're either going to completely skip because you've seen it before, or the bit you've been waiting for, the historical costuming books. None of these are going to be hugely surprising if you've ever seen someone do a historical bookshelf video. You've probably seen them. There aren't that many historical costuming books, and if you see the same ones cropping up again and again, it's because they're the ones. Having said that, I do want to make an honourable mention of these guys. So this is Historic Costumes and How to Make Them, and Medieval Costume and How to Recreate It. They're both published by Dover. These are historical costuming books from the 1920s and 30s that have been reproduced. They are not very accurate. The patterns given, when they do give patterns, this one has a lot of patterns in it, have no grids and no reference material to scale it up. You're pretty much left on your own. As a kind of serious book with which to make historically accurate costumes from, these are kind of useless. As a stocking filler for someone in your life who loves costume, I actually think they're great. Even knowing that some of the scholarship in these books is kind of outdated, I really enjoyed looking through them. They're a lot of fun. The medieval one in particular gave me a bunch of ideas for LARP kit, and it is really nice to see kind of where we have come from in terms of historical costuming research. Jumping to the immediate other end of the spectrum, this thing. So this is the cut of women's clothing by Nora War. There is also the cut of men's clothing, which is, among other things, substantially cheaper. So, negatives. This book is expensive. It is also old. It was written 40 odd years ago, if not longer. Actually, when was it written? First published in 1968. Yeah. This book is 50 years old. Not this exact one. This is, it's a facsimile. But academic historical costume scholarship has moved on since 1968. It's very expensive and the patterns and references inside are not very beginner friendly. However, this is one of those texts that every other book you get and every other YouTube video you follow and blog post you read will assume that you've at least seen this. It's one of those academic texts that is the kind of the baseline that everyone else expands out from. And for that reason, I think it is worth having it. It's also very, very, very pricey, which means that if you're in a position to give someone a kind of elaborate gift that they wouldn't necessarily be able to justify for themselves, this is the man. Oh, how am I going to do this? Are we going to go... I think we're going to go time period, which means the majority of historical costuming books will either give you patterns from extant garments or they will give you drafting instructions. So rules and guidelines on how to draft a new pattern in the historical style, which is not modern flat pattern adjustment. This book will tell you how to create basically any shape from history with flat pattern modifications. This is an extremely technical book. It doesn't really tell you how to do flat pattern drafting. It also doesn't really tell you, for example, what the different historical garments you're trying to recreate necessarily look like. This is a very niche book choice, but if it is your niche, it's amazing. For most of the shapes from the kind of 1600s to 1900s, it will take you through how to create that pattern from a modern sloper or block. And it does this in the form of line-drawn step-by-step guides. Again, you kind of need to know what you're doing. This is not a beginner-friendly book, but if you have someone who's very experienced with flat pattern drafting and is looking to get into historical costuming and is not terribly hung up on the historical method, I love this book. It's a really good place to start, and also I like having it around as a reference for when I have modified things to just double check that that is vaguely the shape that I should have. Then we're going to go earliest, which takes us to The Medieval Tailor's Assistant. I'm going to be honest, this book is not that historically accurate. There's a lot of questions about some of the stuff that's in this book. If, like me, you just want to make LARP kit, amazing! Perfect! Everything you want. It's got patterns for a huge range of garments. It's got lots of information about how they layer and how you do different techniques. There are lots of pictures of the final garments so you know what you're working towards and you can see kind of how they've styled things. And it does cover not just the clothing, but also headgear, hose, other accessories. There's a lot going on in this book. I think if you want something that is 100% definitely historically accurate, you're going to have a lot of problems with some of the stuff in this book. But if you're just looking to start to get into medieval costuming, or you just want to do fantasy stuff, this is a really, really good resource. It is a very useful book. Just some of the research is a bit off. Next up, we have The Tudor Tailor. This is one of my all-time favourite books, and I don't even do Tudor stuff. Additionally, they have several subsequent books. I don't own those, but I really, really want to. The Queen's Servants and the King's Servants in particular are on my wish list for this Christmas. About half of this book is patterns for men and women throughout the Tudor period for a range of styles, social classes. They also have, you know, hoods and hats and coifs and all this good stuff in there. And the other half of the book is scholarship and research, talking about techniques, finishings, different fabrics. They have a wonderful, in fact, can I find it? They have this wonderful chart, which I pull out all the time, which is all the different colours they could achieve with readily available natural dyes in the 16th century. I love this book. As you can see, my copy is quite battered, and that is because I use it all the time. Honestly, cannot recommend it highly enough. I have used the patterns out of it. I made a modified Henrician court gown for one of my LARP characters, and I had absolutely no trouble with the patterns or the construction instructions at all. It was really, really good. Then we're into the 17th century, which until relatively recently had absolutely no information about it whatsoever. But now that has changed. I have book 1 and book 2 from this series. I've only had them since since the beginning of this year, so I haven't had much of a chance to play with them yet. I really like these books. They're very modern, they're very recent, which means that they have a huge amount of information in them, both just in recording what's been found in extant garments and also unpicking exactly how those things were done. The scholarship in these is as up to date as we can get. They give you more than enough information, but also they are very definitely angled towards you being able to recreate the things in this book very, very accurately. The 17th century is no one seems to like the 17th century, and I don't understand, because I think it's one of the best ones. Until very recently, there hasn't been a lot of books and information available for the 17th century. I find it really hard to even find other historical costumers who've made 17th century stuff on the internet. So having these books around is incredible and really, really useful. And they also, I mean, look at them. This would make a wonderful gift. So this next book is not actually the book I want to tell you to buy. So this is Patterns of Fashion 5, which came out last year. It's only available from the School of Historical Dress, and it's the 5th one in a series by a lady called Janet Arnold, who is Janet Arnold is basically one of the OG historical costumers. I had some misgivings about Patterns of Fashion 5, mostly because it has been published posthumously. The book itself has been finished based on Janet Arnold's research by people from the School of Historical Dress. I came around after getting the 17th century dress patterns books, because they're also by some of the same people. Patterns of Fashion 5 is entirely bodies, stays, hoops and rumps 1595 to 1795. I don't care that much about making corsetry or stay making or whatever you want to call it. Patterns of Fashion 5 is kind of niche. Patterns of Fashion 1 and 2, between them, cover the early 18th century through to the 1930s. I use them all the time. All the time, all the time, all the time. I also have Patterns of Fashion 4, which is the 16th century. I use that an awful lot, again when making LARP kit. I don't have Patterns of Fashion 3 because I'm a bad historical costumer and I just went, don't really care that much about shifts and linens. So what I actually want to say is you should buy Patterns of Fashion 1 and 2, maybe 4, but they're out of print at the moment. And there are new editions coming from the School of Historical Dress, but they're not here now. What you can have now is Patterns of Fashion 5. And don't get me wrong, Patterns of Fashion 5 is a really good resource if what you want to make is stays and bodies from the 16th, 17th and 18th century. This is amazing, but I don't think it has as much of a general appeal as Patterns of Fashion 1 and 2 do, so it's a real shame that those are out of print right now. But new editions soon. Woo! 18th century, everyone's favourite. Kind of overdone, you ask me, I say, in the middle of making an 18th century project. Since I've just mentioned that you can't actually get Patterns of Fashion 1 at the moment, which is kind of the book I would recommend if you want a book about patterns taken from extant garments, is this book, Costume Close Up from Colonial Williamsburg. So I really appreciate this book because it has two things that aren't normally covered in extant garment books, which is menswear, very important, and also lower status clothing. This book is a bit odd in that it does contain patterns taken from extant garments, but it kind of doesn't assume that you're going to then make that stuff, which is a little bit weird. In terms of giving you a bunch of historical information and also a lot of patterns, and with Patterns of Fashion 1 currently out of print, this is the book that I would recommend. It doesn't give you any construction information or talk about how the patterns were draped or cut or anything like that, which is where this guy comes in. The American Dutch's Guide to 18th Century Dressmaking doesn't cover a huge number of projects. They basically hit the main beats across the entirety of the 18th century, including the end of the 18th century where everything got interesting, which not everybody does. And it is exclusively women's wear, and they don't talk about stays. The information about how the garments were drafted, cut, and constructed is really, really detailed and shown in a very accessible how-to format with lots and lots of pictures. It will basically talk you through the entire process. I do think it's best paired with something that will give you patterns if you're not super confident drafting your own patterns. And just in terms of how much juicy historical information is in there. It's kind of amazing. If you're quite new to historical costuming and sort of daunted by the amount of information that other books just assume you have, this is a great book to start with, because it does really go down to, we will tell you what stitches you should be using and exactly how to do those. And then finally, we get to my personal favourite, the Victorians. Again, at this point, I would probably recommend you get Patterns of Fashion too, but you can't right now. So, luckily for you, there is an alternative, and that is The Victorian Dressmaker by Isabella Pitcher. Not only is this book incredible, it covers the entire Victorian period from beginning to end, patterns and projects for underwear, corsetry, skirt supports, and dresses themselves, decade by decade through the whole period. There's a second one coming out very, very soon. You can pre-order it now, and it's entirely for kind of sports and activewear, which I'm very excited about because my main use for 1880s clothing involves running away from monsters quite a lot. So I'm looking forward to that one. I've pre-ordered it already. This book does assume that you know what you're doing with a sewing machine. There is some construction information. I wouldn't describe it as suitable for complete beginners. It doesn't assume you're doing everything 100% historical practice either, which is where everyone's other favourite book comes in, which is this guy, Authentic Victorian Dressmaking Techniques. This is slightly misnamed. It was originally published in 1905, and this is a facsimile reproduction, and it is a handbook on how to sew from the Edwardian period. So if you really want to up your game on historical sewing and do your Victorian and Edwardian stitching 100% as it would be done at the time, this is the book to go for. It's not light reading, but I do find myself dipping into it basically any time that I have problems and don't know how to fix them. So, my legs are going to sleep. Been investigated by the cat multiple times because what am I doing? Sat on the floor in the library. And plus it's probably time I draw this video to an end because I've got sewing to do. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do share it with a friend, like, comment and subscribe. Do all the things that make the YouTube gods happy. If you'd like to purchase any of these books for yourself or as gifts, I will include links in the description box below. Where those links are Amazon links, they are Amazon affiliate links, which means that I earn a small commission, really small commission, it's literally pennies, from any purchases you do make clicking those links. And you'll also find a link to my Ko-fi page, which is where you can make a one-off financial donation to support the channel. I will be hopefully back next week with another video, and thus, without much further ado, I will see you next time. And this is going to have terrible audio because I'm just using the camera, but I'm sick and can't be bothered. Oh no, 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 you're going to come here with me? Or apparently you're not, you're going to go under the bed. Okay. The other modern sewing books that I should not have sat on the floor for this whole video. Okay. Cat, what are you doing?